Hi there, welcome to the Ask Historian podcast. I will be your host this week, Brian Watson. We had a brief schedule mishap due to some last minute changes, but I am bringing you this interview podcast a little bit late, but there will be another interview podcast next week. I am also continuing to bring you the best of Ask Historians with Ask Historians Aloud. I know I said last week there would be a poll for listeners to take, but I completely forgot to put it up in the thread. But this podcast poll will definitely be available in this week's podcast feed and thread, so please just keep an eye out for that. And please take it so we can improve things for you. This week's episode will be about the sexual history of the American Civil War. It's a really fun episode, and I hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. And as it is the first episode of the month, we have our Ask Historians book giveaway. The giveaway is for our supporters on Patreon. For $1 a month, you get one chance. For $5, you get two. And for $10, you get three. Please do support us, as there's no one else you can get this sweet historical content. The winner this month will get to pick from a book selected by our guest today, James, which I'll let you know in the email, or a book I'm reading, Cruising the Library, Perversions in the Organization of Knowledge, which is this really interesting new book about the history of the Library of Congress by Melissa Adler that talks about how it categorizes gay and lesbian people and what effects it has on them and on American history. The final choice will be Tales of God's Friends, Islamic Hagiography and Translation, selected by user Sun Against Gold. This remarkable collection gathers a breathtakingly diverse selection of primary texts from the vast repertoire of Islamic stories about holy men and women, also known as friends of God, who are exemplary for their piety, intimacy with God, and service to their fellow human beings. The winner this month is Zach B. I will contact you with your Patreon email, Zach. Thank you for being a supporter. The rest of you can get in on this game at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Now here's the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ask Historian podcast. Today, we are thrilled to have on Ask Historians Flare user nilhaus, who is flared in the American Civil War. Nilhaus is better known as James McAllister to his friends and family, and he has worked in a variety of fields, including journalism, IT, and government. But he's returned to grad school and got his MA and his PhD, all but dissertation in American history and public history. He is working on his dissertation with the aim of beginning work in a museum afterwards. He's here today to talk to us about something that is absolutely essential, in my opinion, the sexual history of the Civil War. But first things first, welcome to the Ask Historian podcast, James.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
So I like to start these interviews with asking kind of what got you interested in history in the first place.
Yeah. I always had a great passion for history as a child. I was always going to museums or asking my parents to take me to museums, always reading books about that sort of thing. It was really in high school that my passion for history sort of came out. My AP American history teacher, whose name was Mr. Cowdery, just had this unbelievable infectious enthusiasm for history to where even the most disinterested student couldn't help but be fascinated by all these stories he would tell. One of our jokes that we always had as students was that he was so nice, he was like Mr. Rogers, but his life was so exciting. He had gone to Vietnam, he had sailed all around the world and been in the Peace Corps, and so he was like Indiana Jones at the same time. So if those two people had had a son, that would have been Mr. Cowdery, our history teacher. But I never quite made that jump from high school into undergraduate history. I only did a minor degree in it, and I would play these sort of video games like Civilization or the Paradox games, which the audience may be familiar with. Europa Universalis, those sorts of games. And it was really about 15 years later that I made the jump into graduate school and decided to get my master's degree in history, and then I decided to continue on in the PhD.
That's so interesting because I know a lot of people jump from their bachelor's into a master's or PhD, but you kind of came back to it later in life, which after much consideration.
Yeah, and I think it's a good thing to do. It helps give people a varied experience. The people who just know they want to do history, I think that's fantastic. But people who have been away for a while or have had different experiences that they can bring into the field of history also helps enrich the entire field. So we're not all just like one monolithic sort of group of people who have only ever done history in our lives.
Would you say if you're a high school student or a college undergrad, you're thinking about it, what would you say is probably the better choice to go out into the world and try to have a separate job first or to jump right into grad school and PhD?
Oh man, that's really hard. I know if I had gone straight from my undergrad into trying to get a PhD, I would have failed. But that
Mm-hmm.
had to do with my own, where I was in my life, my maturity, and all of that sort of thing. Um, so every student I think has got to individually decide that. Do they think that they can take that step up? Because it is you get thrown in the deep end with graduate school. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
I think coming back as an adult, who was about 30 at the time, it's almost easy uh, because coming into graduate school, you do the work, you do it well, you study, treat it like a full-time job, and I never had any significant issues. Not to say it was easy by any means, but the
Mm-hmm.
the workload was very manageable and doable. And it's something I see a lot of younger students struggle with is the dedication that has to be put into graduate school work.
Mm-hmm. I would almost say, just judging off of your experience, it seems like you're less afraid of failing and it's not as like you don't have to go like super deep into debt and know that you'll never be able to get a job with it. It seems because you have that kind of background and experience, you can work someplace else and you've done it before, and this gives
Hmm.
you less of a concern.
Yeah, especially today with the cost of school and loans and everything, having a little bit of that financial worry taken off of your brain certainly helped me. If you've got debt from undergrad and you're just adding more debt to it, that would
Mm-hmm.
drive me crazy with anxiety, I think. So, and my wife had a job, and so she was able to support while I got my TA stipend. So
Mm-hmm.
that definitely took a lot of anxiety off of my mind. So
Yes, I would say as a suffering graduate student with far too much loan debt, definitely figure out how you're going to pay for everything first.
yeah, the one thing you hear a lot of people say is don't pay for graduate school. Um,
Amen. Yeah.
and that's true because that tuition and fees and everything adds up so fast.
Yeah, it really does. So you said when we were first starting for preparation for this, you kind of say that you're interested in doing public history, like museum work and
Hmm.
that sort of thing. And I guess maybe as historians, an extension of that. But what does public history mean to you versus like, I don't know, rivet counting military history or diplomatic history?
Hmm. Um, well, so public history to me is like the way I would separate it is you're not you're not really the person who's necessarily doing that direct educating in a lot of cases. You think of a professor or somebody as standing up on a stage or guiding students through their lessons and so on. But in a lot
Mm-hmm.
of cases, a public historian, especially in like a museum or something, you never even see them in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
All you see is their product, what they've put on display in a museum, for example. This is assuming they're not doing active interpretation or an education program or something like that. And so, in a lot of ways, the public historian, you're not the person or the thing on display. You're not the person who's looking at it either. You're just this in between thing that ensures these two people meet. Um,
Mm-hmm.
one of the I had a quote ready here that I love. Harry Emerson Fosdick said, and Tilden uses this quote himself, that there's two kinds of greatness: one in the genius of the gigantic individual who shapes the course of history, and the other has its basis in the genius of the revealer, which is the man or woman who uncovers something universal in the world that has always been there and that men have not known. This person's greatness is not so much in himself and what he unveils, but is to reveal the universe, is this highest kind of greatness. And Fosdick was talking about Jesus here. And so I'm not saying public historians are like Jesus, but maybe a little bit, just a little bit.
I don't know. I think it might be a good comparison.
Yeah. So to me, it's like the public historian is that person who reveals something that was already there, but which we didn't necessarily see. So it can be literal, like finding an object in an archive or old texts and putting them on display for somebody. One of the objects that Tilden, and I'm saying Tilden, I'm talking about Freeman Tilden, who's sort of the
Mm.
almost creator of the field of public history in a lot of ways.
Oh, good.
He uses an example of the person who took the first, a cross section of an old tree, and the person who was the first who put dates and historic events on all the little rings on the tree
Oh, yeah.
as a way to connect dates and time to this tree in a way that had never been done before. Because, of course, people know about the dates and events and they knew about the tree, but it was this unique way of presenting it that revealed some sort of new information to the observer. And so to me, that's kind of what public history is about, is taking all of this information that other historians may have already done on research and so on, archivists, and showing it to the public, I guess.
I don't know if you've talked to Cassidy Propoco, who is mimic of modes on As Historian, the flaired moderator in the history of fashion.
Mm-hmm.
But in her podcast, which we have coming out, I believe Friday, I asked her something about like what do you think users should take away from museums or public history, and she argues that empathy is essentially what museums are trying to do, create an empathy and understanding, a feeling within the viewer and the people who used to live in this room or this house or that sort of thing.
I think that's fantastic. Yeah, that's definitely to have some sort of a better understanding of the world that these people lived in. Is absolutely one of the goals of the museum, and it does so in a way that I find is you can't quite replicate standing inside a historic building. You can't get that in a classroom necessarily.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's kind of interesting because I think humanities as a whole, at least since we've gotten lost in this postmodern or whatever morass since the end of the Second World War, we've done a very poor job of justifying ourselves to the public. Like our funding, it gets increasingly cut as there's more and more PhDs, but less and less jobs. We don't do a very good job of explaining what the purpose is even of history, of historians to the public. So what is it? Do you agree with that? What does engaging with the public mean to you?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's kind of two issues that can almost be pulled apart. You've got on the one hand the commodification of higher education in general. The idea that you have to justify everything in a financial sense, and on the other hand is really what purpose is this serving? History, other than sure people enjoy it, they like going to museums because it's relaxing or interesting, but does it have a real purpose? We kind of talked about that a little bit. And one of the things that I think people need to understand about history is what Peter Stearns at George Mason said. And I always try to repeat this whenever anyone asks me, what's the point? Is that he says that history is the laboratory of society and human behavior. And what he means by that is the history is all the experiments that we've ever done with human society. And we can learn what the consequences from our actions are and how we can do things differently and improve in a lot of ways. So, an example would be like a diplomat can't just try a couple of different things and see what leads to war and what doesn't lead to war. There's never a control subject in reality.
Yeah.
If you screw up in a nuclear war, that's it. But so what we can do is you can use the past, the history, as a way to gain insight into the future. And I think you need serious historians to sort of do this critical analysis of the past, because it's easy to sort of look back passively on the past and just draw all the wrong conclusions from what was going on. And you can look at any number of terrible, I'm not going to talk too bad about the History Channel necessarily, but there's lots of TV shows that deal with history and so on that just get a lot of things wrong. And that's that sort of lack of the critical analysis of what was happening in the past. Was that the bad history is like another subreddit, I think. I can't think of the subreddit's name. Is it just bad history?
Bad history, yeah.
People who are either willfully or hopefully not willfully, but misinterpreting the past in a lot of ways, and the dangers that can bring. So I think that's one of the biggest roles of historians, is to make sure that people understand that the study of the past is absolutely vital. The issue is how do you use that as like a justification on a monetary sense, that's the difficult part. You just have to get people to appreciate history, which you do through public engagement. Public engagement is essential to make sure that people know what historians are doing and what the importance of what they are doing is.
Yeah.
It's easy in a lot of ways for historians, especially very academic historians, to research and write and teach courses and stay in that very narrow lane. But the reality is that has a very narrow reach outside of the sort of the ivory tower area.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of getting involved in the public, like this sort of podcast,
Yeah.
writing books that aren't just these hard academic books that are for other historians to kind of read, writing op-eds, getting involved with volunteering, speaking out. So one thing I found at a museum is that people are desperate for this kind of information. They really want to have it. And it seems like they're finding the existing pathways for this historical information is insufficient to reach them.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a duty to find new ways to present information in the ways that people want, not in the ways that we want to present the information.
I'm interested. Do you know Carl Becker at all?
The name doesn't ring a bell. Oh,
Okay. Yeah, he wrote an essay that you might find really interesting. It's a little short essay. It's called "Every Man His Own Historian."
yes.
And in it, and I'm quoting here, he says, "We, the historians, are thus of that ancient and honorable company of wise men, of tribe, of bards and storytellers and minstrels, of soothsayers and priests, to whom the successive ages have been trusting the keeping of useful myths." And he goes on to explain, like, he doesn't mean, like, don't let the word myth scare you away. And it's not saying that, like, this is the undivided truth. But he says historians are supposed to preserve and perpetuate social tradition, to harmonize as well as ignorance and prejudice permit the actual and remembered series of events, so that all of society, the tribe, the nation, the mankind as a whole can kind of judge what it is based in what it's done and who it wants to become.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, when you said that, it sounds familiar. I didn't recognize the name offhand. But yeah, that.
Oh, no, I don't expect you to expect a random historian from like the 18th century at all. But no, I quote that because I think that's part of my drive with us historians, but it's also part of my drive of like why we as historians need to do a better job of justifying what the point is or where we're coming from or why.
Yeah, and it's got to be the good and the bad. Everything
Yeah.
to do with history. If you one of the problems I see a lot of times is you walk through. I'm not sure if you live in the American South or not, but there's lots of these old plantations down here that are preserved, and it's not unusual to be able to walk through an entire plantation museum and never see the word slavery a single time because it's uncomfortable to talk about, or their board of directors who runs it doesn't want to sort of get into that mess. But that's also the role of historians, is to tell not just about not just the good history, but the bad and what you've done wrong, because it's the only way you're going to ever do better.
Absolutely. So as much as I'd like to talk history, talk shop with you all day, I think we did have like kind of a larger focus of the podcast.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in I'm American. I come from an American background, but American history never really been a focus of mine. But for like non-Americans or those like me who didn't pay that much attention to it in high school, what is the Civil War? Why and when, where, or how did this start?
Sure. Yeah, so it's like the biggest part. Hardest. You could ask any historian of America almost. The real big picture of the American Civil War, and the sort of builds up for a long time. But in 1860 and early 1861, a group of elite slaveholders in the American South decided to leave the United States of America and form their own country called the Confederate States of America.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this leads to a war that goes on for about 4 years. Hundreds of thousands of people are killed in the combat, and these rebellious states are eventually absorbed back into the United States. The why is, the short answer is slavery, is what anyone will tell you. It's very much at the core of everything that happens in the American Civil War. But it's easy to it's easy to overstate and it's easy to understate at the same time the role that slavery played. The way I would explain it in just a couple sentences is that in the slave owners had been the dominant power in American politics since the creation of the country. But by the 1860s, a lot of these elite slave owners had noticed that their power was waning because of changing demographics and where people lived. And general attitude of Americans was trending slowly towards an uncomfortableness with slavery. And this isn't to say Americans were becoming abolitionists necessarily. They just didn't like the idea of slavery dominating the country. And there were outspoken abolitionists at the time, obviously. When Abraham Lincoln won the Republican candidate and then got voted in as president in 1860, a lot of Southern slave owners saw this as sort of the beginning of the end, where the country had kind of turned a corner towards ending slavery. And so these elite slave owners kind of decided to cut their losses and go make their own country. But it didn't work out for them, obviously.
not as well as they hoped it would, anyways.
No, and yeah, I'm okay with that. That's fine. That's fine with me.
Yeah, I would say I think a positive turnout.
Yeah. And so by the end of the war in 1865, whereas the North had been maybe uncomfortable to ambivalent towards slavery, by 1865, they actually completely outlaw slavery and force Southern states to acknowledge this. So in the course of just 4 years, there's a rapid change in the way Americans view freedom and slavery and equality that, might have taken much longer if it sort of hadn't been had to, state your opinion at gunpoint, essentially.
So I guess to focus on the people actually fighting the war, who were these soldiers? Can you kind of describe the life and attitude of a common Union soldier might have been like?
Yeah. There's so many, there were literally millions of Union soldiers. So of course their lives were going to be very different, but there are a lot of things that they had in common. One of the things, I should say there's sort of a myth, that the Union soldiers weren't as patriotic or weren't as tough as soldiers as the South. And of course, this is something most people acknowledge to be not true. People in the Union were just as patriotic and hardworking and hard fighting as those in the South. Almost 80% of these people would have come from rural areas, from farms. A quarter of them would have been born in Europe or another foreign country.
Wow.
And almost half of them had parents who were from another country. So they were also highly literate, a fantastically high number. I forget the exact amount. Some 90% were literate. They engaged in political talking, roundtables, over campfires at night, and they read newspapers and had debate societies. The average Union soldier was 26 or 27 years old, too. So these were not kids. This is not like maybe how we would envision the Vietnam War, made up of 18 and 19-year-olds. These were adults who had had lives that they set aside to go and fight for the cause of the Union. And it's easy. One of the things I tell so many of my students is we live in such a cynical age today. And I'm not trying to poo-poo on modern people necessarily.
Right. But
it's easy to forget that millions of these people willingly died for a cause, the cause of the Union. They believed in it enough to go and die for it. And I think today it's difficult for us to understand that level of dedication to such a high concept. Confederate soldiers, similar in a lot of ways, genuine in their conviction. They would have had a very strong sense of desire to prove themselves, because people living in the South lived almost in a lot of ways, their own sort of country, a cultural nation into itself, because it was very closed off. They had a male ban. You couldn't discuss anything to do with abolition. Certain politics couldn't be discussed. Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in a lot of countries in the South. And so when they went to war, they had this preconceived notion of what the North was like and what Northerners was like, which was very quickly dispelled. So, They thought that one Confederate soldier could take 10 Union soldiers, but that was definitely not the case. So
That's unfortunately very bad
yeah.
math.
But for all of them, I would just say that life in the army would have been miserable.
Yeah.
Life in the military can be miserable in a lot of ways, but the thing to remember is 99% of the time for these people was spent marching and camping, and just doing mundane, boring activities day in and day out.
Mm-hmm. So of course they're all very. I mean, despite not being quite teenagers, they're still young men, probably in their prime, and very interested in sex and sexuality. Yes. So just having all that concentration must have been very interesting. I try to use the word interesting, but very complicated to manage. But
yeah,
what was the attitude of kind of the general American public towards sex and sexuality that they were coming from?
I like to tell people it's probably a lot like it was today. People
mm-hmm.
today are fairly, generally conservative about sex. You don't talk about it in public and so on. When you compare the 1860s to, America 2 generations before, America around the Revolution, it would have seemed incredibly conservative. America during the Revolution was this very sexually open in a lot of ways society that would probably seem strange to us today.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult to sort of measure that kind of thing, but one that I like to talk about is, in 1760, we know that about 35% of brides were pregnant during their wedding ceremony.
Wow.
And by 1860, this had fallen to 10%, and it jumped up immediately after the war, but then went back down. So that gives you an idea of the changing in society that had taken place. America is becoming more and more conservative. The idea that we have this Victorian sense of morality is not necessarily wrong. But the thing to always, of course, keep in mind is that we're almost always talking about elite white society when we talk about this sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
These brides pregnant and marriage and stuff, this doesn't even take into consideration the millions of enslaved people. They were never surveyed for any of this. And a lot of times people don't even bother to survey working class people living in rural farms. And it doesn't even take into account the hundreds of thousands of millions of people who just had common law marriages. They would just say they were married one day, for example. So
right.
Anytime we're talking about society, it's almost always talking about elite society and how people wanted to be seen.
Right. And their attitudes towards, I guess, talking about sex in public, even Victorians were very... Victorians, the famous characterization, British Victorians I'm talking about, the famous characterizations, they weren't necessarily against sex, but they were just against talking about it in public. Does that hold true for the Americans
Absolutely,
as well?
Absolutely, yeah. You would not talk about sex in public. You would talk about not having sex was maybe how you would talk about sex. There's all these books and pamphlets that we have easy access to, about how masturbation was considered self-harm and could lead to insanity and physical deformity and those sorts of things.
Right.
Lots of sort of role models during the Civil War, people like Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, that were held up as these virtues of morality, engaged in very sort of public self-denial, which was considered this great thing to aspire to, was to deny yourself any sort of pleasure and
mentally stable for some reason.
And of course, it's now looking back on it, it's so weird to think about those people having sex. Nobody probably wants to think about Abraham Lincoln having sex, but he did. I mean, these are all these people are sexual beings, but for whatever reason, we look back on the Civil War, we hold it in such high regard that to associate sex with it almost seems like it debases it in a way. Is one of the things I run into a lot. People don't really want to talk about it. They feel like to think about these people engaging in sex or masturbation or reading pornography or going to prostitutes somehow besmirches the honor or the sacrifice that they gave.
So that's an interesting point. So what does it mean to be like a sexual being in these camps? Do they have access to prostitutes or their wives, or I guess, masturbation in that sense. How was sexuality played out with like all these men?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, these were, kind of men in their prime in a lot of ways. So of course they're hugely sexual beings, and we have lots of evidence of this, both in the physical evidence that they left behind, talking about mountains of pornography in some cases that were literal mountains of pornography, which were confiscated by some colonel who held himself up as a virtue.
Sounds like my paradise.
Yeah. And they would burn it a lot of times in these huge effigies. And even in the cities, you had preachers telling people to come and burn their pornography or any number of things like that. There's people with photographers and book publishers would mail thousands and thousands of catalogs, and they would take them to fortresses or encampments and distribute them to soldiers. And they could actually mail order pornography,
right?
And they would keep it with them, of course, whether it was a book or just some photographs, or but they could also order sex toys, dildos, condoms, fulfill sort of any sexual desire that these people would have had. And like you said, prostitutes, of course, they were available, famously so in a lot of cases, the number of prostitutes. One thing I'd like to say is there were, of course, professional women who engaged in prostitution as their full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
But my experience in reading through a lot of the documentation is that most of the women who engaged in prostitution did so as a way to supplement whatever income they would have had, or they did it just opportunistically.
Absolutely, yeah.
Been, washerwomen, laundry people, seamstresses, cooks, even in some cases people's spouses might have engaged in it occasionally as a way to make some money, or as needed for whatever reason to stay safe or something like that. In the beginning of the war, people would bring their wives, but that sort of quickly becomes frowned upon as the war gets taken more and more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say venereal diseases was also a huge problem, which was one of the big reasons why officers tried to cut down on prostitution. So,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of been true of every military in every place in time, hasn't it been?
Absolutely. I think I've heard, based on surviving medical records, it was not uncommon for about a quarter of soldiers to suffer from venereal diseases of some kind.
Wow.
So,
wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, so we know they were having sex. And that's a huge spike in venereal diseases. That was not a common level from before the war. So that was happening.
One of the... yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, so they were having sex.
They were having sex.
As
the war, of course, drags on and there's less access to wives and they start cracking down on prostitutes and other sex material, what about homosexuality? I feel like it's a topic that doesn't get touched, especially in the American South. Was it a real concern in the military?
Yeah, it's probably surprising how not to say how little of a concern, but there was a concern for it in the Navy, famously, which had they had a 5-year punishment was for sodomy in the Navy, but there was no actual real direct rules or laws against homosexuality, which is not to say that they were tolerant of it. It's probably more they just didn't consider that it would ever happen. But there were certainly people with varying ideas of sexuality during the Civil War, whether that we would today call that perhaps homosexuality or bisexuality and so on. It's just, like any historian will tell you, be careful about projecting the present onto the past.
Absolutely, yeah.
If we transported some of those people today, I'm sure they would say that with our modern vocabulary that they were homosexual. I've come across a few court-martial cases that deal with homosexuality. It's interesting how frank and upfront they are about exactly what is taking place. I don't want to be too vulgar on this podcast, but there's no doubt about what is being put where. When these people are alone.
You don't have to worry about being that vulgar. We're 35 minutes in. I mean, if they haven't already,
yeah,
they haven't already been scared off, then they're probably fine, right?
And so the interesting thing is these cases almost only ever come up because they irritated the wrong person,
Right.
or they got on someone's bad side and they turn them in or something like that. I'm of course led to believe that this must have been happening much more common, and it's just a case of brothers in arms who are simply tolerant of this kind of behavior. They look the other way, perhaps, or that's just how this person is, and so on. And it's only when somebody decides to turn them in that it becomes a problem. But then at the same time, it's people back then did a lot of things that we would perhaps consider some type of non-heterosexual behavior. In these camps, it was not unusual to have some men dress up in dresses and put on bonnets, and you would have a big dance party. That was considered perfectly normal behavior. But I think if
Yeah,
people did that,
I would agree with you.
or when men slept in the same bed together, that was not considered strange in any way. So we kind of got to go both ways, not projecting, but also not interpreting certain behavior as being heterosexual or homosexual. They just had different beliefs about things. So
Yeah, I would agree with you. My general impression is I of course agree with the idea that you can't project ideas of homosexuality and heterosexuality in the past. I mean, you don't really have them probably till the 1890s or so, with the trial of Oscar Wilde is really like the real kickoff international moment. So there was real no like homosexual man that did homosexual things and hung out with homosexuals. It was just kind of, it would happen. It was kind of generally accepted. It was considered part of an everyday sexuality, but still wrong, or not really discussed or talked about until, as you said, somebody got suspicious or angry or jealous and turned somebody else in.
Yeah, it's really only in the Navy, and I don't know enough history about the Navy, but they seem to just have a prohibition against, just don't do it. And I'm not sure what the history of that is exactly, but
Sure, I'm gonna probably butcher this, and I can hear Jay Schooltiger, who is our resident British naval history expert, probably frowning on me. But I think the distinction is there is no truly private place upon a ship.
That would make sense.
In a sense, they're private-ish, or barracks. You can have private moments or some areas of privacy, but in a ship there is no truly private place.
That would make sense. Yeah, and of course, in the Civil War, people are not wandering off all the time, but it was easy enough to get away for a little bit.
I'm interested in those mountains of pornography that you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
What were they had access to? I mean, one of the greatest concerns coming out of the Civil War is, of course, Anthony Comstock, who was a soldier in the Civil War, but he really got his start busting people for having dirty magazines and stuff like that. Was it a real concern, or what was the material they were kind of dealing with?
Yeah, it was a concern. People were, in some ways, it was a very practical concern, in that they believed that pornography was either distracting, or it would lead to them seeing prostitutes, which would in turn lead to venereal diseases, which would lead to soldiers not being able to fight. And at the same time, it was a very spiritual concern. Officers were in a lot of ways charged with the spiritual well-being of their soldiers, the moral standing of their soldiers in a lot of ways. And so they genuinely believed that whatever pornography or sex toys or prostitution was bad for their soul. And as to what they had access to, photography, whether it be sort of artful nudes, I guess is what some people would call it. But of course, tasteful nudes. But when you've been, marching for 2 years, tasteful nudes are just as good as deliberate pornography.
Or just enough.
Of course, there was deliberate pornography was taken both in the written form and photography, drawings. We have surviving letters where soldiers have scribbled some little dirty drawing on it that they just either did for fun, or perhaps they found it titillating or something.
Right.
And I'm trying to hear it was in England alone in the 1850s, they produced 200 million pornographic photographs a year.
Just about, yeah. By then, probably, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, a lot of that is being sent to America, and soldiers are buying this. So yeah, it was a very real thing, and that there's millions and millions of these photographs being bought and destroyed and carried. So yeah, literal mountains over it, and this moral panic was very real over it as well. There was this concern for people in the military. You wanted them to look morally upright, spiritually upright, and so on. I would say there was a famous Reverend James C. Richmond, who was a very outspoken anti-pornography person. He actually met with Lincoln at one point. Yeah, and he sort of got busted for a bunch of dirty letters that he had written and drawn pornographic images on, and he kind of fell from grace after that. So nobody was immune.
One of the people I, of course, focus on, is probably the only person I really focus on for Civil War, is Anthony Comstock. And I think he makes an interesting test case because I don't know, my awareness of him, that he actually didn't spend much time fighting, if at all. He had an older brother who died in the war, and he signed up to go avenge his brother. He spent most of his time in Florida marching around and cleaning his barracks, so he didn't really have much to do on his hands. So this is the one way he had of acting out, or trying to find a moral purpose or a moral vendetta to his life. He kind of saw people who distribute pornography and prostitutes as being partially responsible for his brother's death. So these little mountains of pornography is one thing that really upset him, and I think that got kind of he's so fascinating because he, of course, becomes famous later in life, but he also is he's also the exact opposite of everybody around him who would just consume it and use pornography as most soldiers would.
Yeah, and he's Comstock. He's a true believer of this kind of anti-pornography, moral uprightness in a lot of ways. And I think he's probably the kind of person that a lot of people would have looked to and said was, well, this is probably how we should be acting. But the reality is very few people were. And of course, that's so common throughout history, and it's common today that everybody looks up to these virtuous people, but then when the doors are closed, we kind of do what we're going to do regardless. And we talk the talk, don't walk the walk necessarily on a lot of things. In the same way that people would have looked up to Lincoln, or they would have looked up to Lee, as these virtuous, self-denying people. But then, of course, they turn around and there's the mountain of pornography behind them.
Yeah.
So, and of course, Comstock, his trying to find meaning and purpose and reasons behind the death. That's just what everybody struggled with in the American Civil War. It was death and suffering on a scale that had never been even imagined by the American public. Huge percents of just generations dying off in what seemed like senseless warfare, and everybody's trying to why are they dying? What purpose could this possibly serve? And for some people like Comstock, that might have come through, the death is because of our immorality, and so we have to be more virtuous. And virtue, not only does it make us better people, but it plays into the self-denial and the idea of suffering for a good purpose.
That was a fantastic answer, by the way. Just wanted to say that was really fantastic.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to kind of bring us towards a sort of conclusion. How does the sexual culture of the Civil War still affect us today?
Yeah, and in some ways, it's almost right now. I would say it's almost like the opposite of the sexual, whatever the inverse of the sexual history of the Civil War is what we have today. We have a lack of sexual history, which is so weird because every other war America has been involved in, we have this sexual history, whether it be in Vietnam, where of course we know soldiers were having lots of sex, both consensual and non-consensual. In both world wars, there's lots of sex taking place. In the Revolution, there's lots of sex taking place. But for whatever reason, in the American Civil War, it's this very sterile, virtuous, self-denying reality is how we imagine it. I'm sure much to the Comstock would be very happy that that's how we imagine the Civil War took place. And so, in a lot of ways, we have a false or incomplete understanding of the Civil War. And so, understanding the sexual culture of the Civil War just gives us a better understanding of the war itself and the people who fought in it. And also, in kind of a way, it knocks the Civil War down a peg as the not I mean, it's my main area of study, but it's so easy for people to put
Right.
that war up on this peg of this was the moment when America really, put everything on the line and denied ourselves everything for the purpose of reuniting the country.
Right.
And the reality is they were still regular people who were engaging in sex and other real things. These are real people. And I think if you can't see Civil War soldiers as real people, then people don't really understand the Civil War.
Yeah, that's kind of leads into my last question is like, what should people take away from this podcast or just from the research you do?
Yeah, I would say just that these are what I just said. These are real people who were struggling in a lot of ways with understanding what the war was about, what did it mean to be American, what are our morals at the time, and to not view people who fought in the war or carried out the war or were leading during the war as some sort of special people that are beyond reproach. Nobody in history or today is beyond reproach. Everybody has their flaws and their good parts and bad parts and so on. But what I would want people to think is that these were real people, I guess, in the Civil War is kind of what I would.
Well, that's great. I think you've kind of given us a summary, even from like the very basic of the Civil War all the way to what we should really kind of consider going forward. But as always, I know, especially with a topic like this, there will be follow-up questions in Ask Historians, and I hope you will come along and join us in the thread to answer them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it, James.
Great. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.